Welcome back to Nature Documentary for Sleep. If you enjoy these quiet expeditions, leave a comment and consider liking and subscribing. Tonight, you're crossing the Strait of Messina, the narrow seam between Calabria and Sicily. It's 2:40 in the morning on a car ferry, and the air smells like warm diesel and salt. The water looks calm until you notice patches that go glassy, then wrinkle the wrong way. You lean on the rail and follow the surface seams, where Tyrrhenian and Ionian waters trade places. The crew works chains and ramps like it's any other night, which is how this place stays convincing. Then the hull yaws a fraction, not from wind, but from a current line grabbing at your course. You realize navigation here starts before the narrows, because the flow is layered and reversible. So what happens when that two-story current meets steep slopes and a faulted seabed right on the tide's turning point? You get your first answer as a sound, not a sight. A low, wet hiss slides along the hull like someone tearing cloth underwater. It is the ferry's skin being read by the current, which means the current is also reading you back. You thought this was a short commute between two ports. Wrong. This is a moving argument between two seas, and you are standing on the punctuation. You shift your weight, and the deck answers with a tiny sideways sway. Not enough to scare you, but enough to inform you. The strait does not need waves to be dangerous. It only needs direction. A man in a reflective vest walks past you with a coil of rope. He glances at the water the way you glance at a clock. Not romance, not fear, just routine. And that is the first escalation. If the people who work here treat this like normal, then the danger is baked in, not exceptional. You look ahead, and the lights on both coasts seem too close for comfort. Calabria's shore is a line of sodium orange, messy and low. Sicily's side rises darker, like a shoulder under a blanket. The gap between them tightens, and with it, the air changes. It cools a little, and it smells more metallic. Land is funneling the wind, and the funnel is aimed at you. You notice the ferry is not pointed straight at Messina. It is angled, slightly, like a person leaning into a crowd. That angle is not style. It is compensation. Because in the Strait of Messina, you do not travel across the water. You travel across moving water that is traveling across you. A car alarm chirps once on the lower deck, then goes quiet. Somewhere behind you, a truck idles, and the exhaust hangs in the cold like a slow thought. The ferry's engines deepen, and the vibration comes up through your shoes. The captain is adding power early, not because you are late, because this is where the narrows begin to pull. You lean farther over the rail, careful of the damp metal. Down on the surface, the seams you were watching start to sharpen. One band looks slick and heavy, almost oily, even though you know it is just water. Next to it, another band wrinkles and skitters, as if something is pushing from beneath. Those are not random patterns. They are the surface signature of two water masses trading places, like commuters swapping trains. The Tyrrhenian wants in, the Ionian wants out, and the strait is the only doorway. A gull cries once, too awake for this hour, then disappears into the dark. You follow the sound, and you realize the darkness here is layered too. There is the black of open water, then the softer black of the near shore, then the blackest black of the hills. where rock rises and steals the remaining light. You think the danger is all in the sea, but the sea is only half the machine. The other half is the land. You can see it in the way the slopes climb straight out of the towns. Terraces cut into the hillside like old stitches, pale scars where fresh rock has been exposed, brighter than everything around it. Places where the hillside has slumped, and someone has tried to pin it back in place with concrete. The shorelines here are steep because the ground is not done moving, and steep ground makes fast consequences. A stronger tug catches the ferry now, and the bow nudges offline. It is subtle, but it happens without wind and without visible wave. That is the strait reminding you it can touch a ship without touching the surface. The ferry corrects, easing back like an animal adjusting its stance. You watch the wake and you see something you did not expect. Instead of a clean V-shape fading behind you, the wake is being grabbed. It kinks sideways, then breaks into little chevrons. The current is twisting it, rearranging it, and swallowing it. That is evidence, simple and rude. If the strait can do that to your wake, it can do that to anything smaller. A small boat, a swimmer, a rescue line, even a floating person who thought the sea would carry them gently. You hear a chain clank, loud in the quiet. The crew is securing something on the vehicle deck, preparing for the bumpier belt in the middle. They do it without drama, which means this belt is expected. You look for the mid-channel buoys and find their lights blinking, patient and indifferent. Even the buoys here look like they are bracing. The ferry slides closer to the tightest part of the strait. You can almost feel the shores leaning in, not physically, not truly, but your brain reads it that way anyway. It is a human brain, and it hates pinch points. Pinch points mean traps, and traps mean decisions. You make your first real decision now. You could go inside, find a seat, and let the crossing happen to you. Or you can stay out here and learn what the water is doing. In real time, you keep your hands on the rail and stay outside. Not because you are brave, because if this place is going to be dangerous, you want to at least know how. The wind nudges your face with a chill edge, and the diesel smell thins. In its place comes the cleaner scent of open water, cold and mineral. The ferry's lights paint a small moving world, and everything beyond stays black. That makes the strait feel wider than it is. A trick, because the true width is not measured from shore to shore. It is measured from safe water to unsafe water, and that distance is always shifting. A standing wave appears off the starboard side, faint but steady. It does not travel like a normal wave. It just sits there in one spot as if the sea has hit a speed bump. That is exactly what it is. The flow is hitting an underwater step, a sudden change in depth. Water has no choice but to climb over it, and the climbing creates a persistent hump, a small reminder that the seabed is not smooth. It is faulted and folded, like a floor that has been kicked from below. You watch another patch of water go strangely matte, then bloom into ripples that run against the general motion. That is sheer, two layers moving at different speeds, rubbing like mismatched gears. It looks gentle from above. It feels like strength if you were in it. The ferry's bow light catches a brief swirl, a spiral dimple that forms and vanishes. Not a mythic whirlpool, not a cinematic funnel, just rotational water. The beginning of spin, born from uneven flow, scaled down to reality, but still capable of grabbing the wrong craft at the wrong time. A passenger steps onto the deck near you, jacket unzipped, hair messy from sleep. He looks at the water for 10 seconds, then looks away. People do that here. They do not stare too long. The Strait has a way of making you feel like staring is an invitation. The ferry keeps its angled posture, still not pointing directly where it is going. That angle becomes more obvious as the lights of Messina widen ahead. You realize the captain is not steering toward the port. He is steering toward where the port will be after the current has had its say. Navigation here is a negotiation with time. If you aim at the destination, you miss it. If you aim beside it, you arrive. The coastline on the Calabria side reveals a darker bulge, Scylla's headland, crouched at the edge like an animal watching the channel. It looks ancient, and it is. But the rock under it is not as stable as the silhouette suggests. This entire region is stitched with faults that pull the land apart. Normal faults, the kind where one side drops relative to the other. A simple motion, geologically speaking, like a book sliding off a table, very slowly until it suddenly does not. The strait exists because the land here has been stretched and broken, not once, but repeatedly, over long time. And broken land creates broken seabeds. Broken seabeds creates uneven flow. Uneven flow creates the kind of current lines that just grabbed your hull. Cause and effect, stacked neatly like paperwork. Only the paperwork is written in salt water and basalt. A vibration changes beneath your feet. The engines are steady, but the sensation shifts, becoming slightly higher, more insistent. You realize you are crossing into a faster stream, a ribbon of water moving like a conveyor belt. The ferry responds by pushing harder, maintaining control. This is not dramatic. It is constant. And constant danger is always harder to respect because it does not announce itself with a scream. You notice the shore lights on both sides start to slide backward faster. The ferry is in the main throat now. This is where the strait earns its reputation as a hydraulic bottleneck. Water wants to equalize between basins, but the basins do not breathe in sync. The Tyrrhenian and the Ionian have different rhythms, different densities, different moods, so the water does not simply go in and out. It surges, it reverses, and it layers. A two-story ocean. Surface water can be heading north while deeper water heads south, or the other way around. And when tides turn, those layers can trade places like tired workers changing shifts. You cannot see the deeper layer, but you can see its fingerprints, a line of foam that travels sideways for no obvious reason, a patch of calm that sits where you expect chop, a sudden riffle that appears in a smooth lane, then disappears as if swallowed. You are watching a conversation between layers you are not invited into. The ferry's wake continues to misbehave. It is not trailing behind in a tidy ribbon anymore. It is being torn into slanted segments, each one caught by a different microcurrent. That tells you the flow is not a single river. It is braided, and braided flow is what makes small mistakes become big ones. Because when conditions change over a distance shorter than a ship length, predictions become guesses. You think about the old stories of Scylla and Charybdis, monsters on either side devouring sailors who strayed. People love to pretend those were just myths. But myths are often just physics, wearing a costume. Here, the costumes are cliffs and currents. The monsters are a narrow channel, steep bathymetry, and a tide schedule that does not care about your confidence. The ferry passes a point where the surface roughens in a wide belt. It is not large waves, just agitated water, like a pot beginning to simmer. A plastic cup on a nearby bench shivers, then skitters a few centimeters. A small, domestic object offering you a small, domestic warning. A woman near the door grips the handrail, not panicked, just adjusting. Your body does the same thing without asking permission. Muscles anticipate motion because they have learned the strait's grammar. If you were in a smaller vessel, this would be the part where you start making compromises. Do you fight the current and waste fuel? Do you ride it and risk being carried offline? Do you slow down and let the tide turn, hoping the reversal helps you? Every choice has a cost, and the strait charges interest. The ferry, at least, has power and mass. But even mass can be guided if the flow is organized enough. You watch the far water for another standing wave and find it. A pale ridge that glows under the ferry lights, unmoving. That ridge is not wind. It is water piling over an underwater ridge, a step in the seabed. And that step exists because the earth here has been broken and shifted. Fault blocks, dropped sections, lifted shoulders, a seabed shaped like a cracked sidewalk. You feel the urge to look up at the hills again, so you do. And the hills look close enough to touch, which is another trick of night. But you can still see the evidence of instability. Retaining walls, terraces, road cuts, a pale landslide scar that runs from high slope down toward the town like a spilled sheet. The strait is not just water passing through a gap. It is water passing through a gap in actively deforming land. That matters because deforming land does not hold still during storms, or quakes, or heavy rain. It sheds material, and when material falls into water, water responds. Sometimes with a wave, sometimes with turbidity, a churning underwater avalanche that can break cables and pipes, sometimes with a sudden change in depth that alters the currents for years. You begin to understand why navigation starts before you arrive, because the hazard is not one thing. It is a stack of interacting processes, and each one can amplify the next. The ferry's course correction becomes more noticeable now. A gentle turn, then a steady hold. You can almost feel the captain watching the tide table, the wind, the current reports, and the lived memory of every crossing before this one. The captain is not fighting the strait. He is timing it, and timing is what keeps this crossing ordinary. That is the most unsettling part. This place can be navigated, yes, but only if you treat it like a living schedule, not a static map. You glance down at your phone, not for signal, but for the time. 2:48, only 8 minutes since you stepped into this moving choke point. And already the water has tried to steer you. The seabed has revealed itself through standing waves, and the shores have shown you their scars. You remember the question you asked at the rail? What happens when this 2-story current meets steep slopes and a faulted seabed? The answer is, it becomes a machine that can turn small disturbances into compound problems. A ferry can handle it most nights, but the strait does not reserve its worst behavior for storms. Sometimes it waits for stillness, because Reversals happen whether the sky is dramatic or not. You notice something else, subtle but telling. The ferry's lights catch a faint line of debris, tiny bits of foam and plant matter arranged in a long curve, a convergence line. Two surface flows meeting and pushing floating things together like hands gathering crumbs. If you fell in, the strait would not just carry you away. It would sort you. It would decide where you accumulate, where you sink, where you spin. It would make geometry out of your panic. A loudspeaker crackles briefly, then stops. No announcement, just a test or a habit. A small red light above the wheelhouse window blinks once, then holds steady. It is not for you. It is for the crew, a quiet reminder that rules exist here because water does not negotiate. You stay on deck anyway because the moment you go inside, the strait becomes a rumor again. Out here, it is evidence. The ferry glides into a darker band of water, and the sound changes. The hull stops slicing cleanly and starts pushing, like the sea has thickened. You look down, and the surface is doing that wrong direction thing again. Ripples traveling against the ferry, as if the ship is reversing without telling you. This is the bottleneck, doing what bottlenecks do. It forces motion to compress, and then it punishes anything that assumes the world is uniform. You try to pick a single reference point, one shore light, one pier, one slope line. Your eyes want to anchor the scene, but the scene refuses. The ferry is moving forward, but the water is sliding sideways, and the wind is sliding the other way. 3 vectors, 3 arguments, 1 narrow throat. Congratulations. You have stepped into a place where even directions have layers. A deckhand walks to the rail and spits, casual as punctuation. The spit hits the surface, and instead of trailing behind, it skims off at an angle. That is your demonstration. The surface layer is not loyal to your path, and the surface is the friendly layer, the one you get to see. Below it, there is a deeper counterflow, colder and denser, moving the opposite way. A 2-story ocean built like a scam. Anything with a keel, anything with depth, gets tugged by both floors at once. If you are a small boat, you get twisted. If you are a swimmer, you get sorted. Like laundry. If you are a ferry, you get a captain who corrects early and often and without drama. That is the key detail. No one is shouting. No one is running. The danger here is procedural. The ferry begins a slow, deliberate turn, not toward Messina, but away from it. The turn is so smooth you only notice because your stomach notices first. Your inner ear is a petty accountant tracking every unpaid motion. The shoreline lights slide across your vision, and you understand the trick. The captain is setting up an approach angle that will still work after the current shoves you. He is steering for a future where the sea gets its boat. This is why the strait has a reputation. Not because it is always violent, because it is always involved. You watch the water for the seams again, and now you see more than lines. You see texture boundaries, like fabric stitched to different fabric. A glossy lane, then a lane of tiny choppy diamonds, a faint foam stripe, then an empty slick, then another foam stripe, all curving like fingerprints. Those curves are the map of invisible forces. In a normal channel, you would read the shoreline. Here, You read the surface like a doctor reads skin, looking for bruises that explain internal damage. And the surface keeps hinting at the shape of the bottom. A standing wave appears, then another, offset from the first. Not tall, not dramatic, just persistent humps that refuse to travel. They sit there because the flow is forced upward over submerged steps. Those steps are fault blocks, pieces of crust dropped and tilted. The seabed here is not a smooth bowl. It is a broken staircase. Water hates stairs. It trips, it accelerates, it spins. It makes turbulence where you expected transit. You let your eyes climb from the water to the hills again. The hills do not rise like calm mountains. They rise like snapped bones, steep slopes, abrupt ridges, gullies cut deep as if something has been clawing the earth. That something is water, mostly. Rain that falls fast, runs faster, and drags everything loose downhill. But water is only the day shift. The night shift is geology. You are crossing a place where the crust has been stretched like old dough, pulled thin until it tore. The tearing created normal faults, the kind that drop one side down. Over time, those drops made the strait. And the faults are not finished, they are just quiet, which is not the same thing. The ferry's engines thrum in a steady way, but the vibration underfoot has a second rhythm now, a faint, intermittent shiver, like a distant truck passing over a bridge. You know it is not a truck. It is the hull interacting with microturbulence, little pressure changes in the flow. Your body files that sensation away, because later, if the earth ever truly shakes, you will need to know the difference. A gust cuts across the deck colder than before. It comes straight down the channel, funneled by land like breath through teeth. The Strait of Messina is a wind machine too. Air behaves like water when it gets squeezed. It accelerates, it howls, it pushes. Tonight, it is only nudging, but it is enough to remind you that hazards stack here. Current, wind, slope, fault, all in the same narrow corridor. You glance at the Calabria side again, towards Scylla's dark headland. The name is a myth stuck to a rock. Scylla, the cliff monster, the teeth in the stone. On the opposite side, Charybdis, the whirlpool, the mouth in the sea. The old stories were not a geography lesson, not officially. They were a survival note written in poetry. Do not trust the channel. Do not assume the center is safe. Do not assume the edge is safe either. Pick your compromise and accept that the compromise may still kill you. You watch a patch of water near mid-channel tighten into a slow spiral. It is small, almost shy. Then it collapses, replaced by a different swirl a few meters away. That is what shear does. It creates rotating boils, little vortices that pop in and out, like the sea is thinking. If you were in a kayak, this would be the moment your arms start lying to you. You would paddle straight and still drift sideways. You would correct, and the correction would feed the spin. You would look at the shore and realize it is getting closer, but not the shore you wanted. And then you would learn why people here respect timetables and tide windows. Not because they love paperwork, because water can move faster than your decisions. The ferry crosses another rough belt, and the deck tilts just enough for you to widen your stance. A small child inside the cabin laughs, a bright sound, muffled. through glass. Even here, even now, life insists on being normal. That is how hazard zones stay populated, not through ignorance, but through adaptation. Humans can get used to anything, even a corridor that occasionally erases cities. You drift toward the cabin door, not to surrender, but to gather information. Inside, the air is warmer, thick with upholstery and tired perfume. A television mounted high shows muted news, the anchor's mouth moving without sound. The real soundtrack is the ferry itself, the low mechanical hum that tries to lull you. You walk past rows of seats where bodies slump, coats pulled up to chins. People sleep with the trust of commuters. They have done this crossing so many times that danger has become background. A laminated safety notice is posted near the wall. It shows a simplified diagram of the vessel, arrows for exits, icons for life jackets. The language is calm, official, almost offended that it has to explain itself. You read it anyway, not because you plan to panic, because you want to know what the adults tell themselves. A man in his 60s sits with a coffee, eyes open, not reading anything. He looks like he has been awake since the 1980s. You take the seat across from him, careful not to invite conversation, which of course invites conversation. He nods toward the window, toward the black water. He says something about the current, a casual remark, like commenting on traffic. You answer with a non-committal sound. He takes that as permission. He mentions earthquakes the way people mention rain, not as a fear, but as a category. Then he says it, the phrase that lives here, the big one. He does not say a year at first. He does not need to. Here, there is a default disaster, the way some places have a default mountain. He watches your face to see if you know. You let your eyes lower, respectful, and he gives you the date like he is handing you a heavy object. 28th of December, 1908. Before dawn. He says it without theatrics, which makes it worse, because the most frightening facts are the ones people can recite calmly. The cabin lights reflect on the window, making it hard to see outside. Your own face floats on the glass, ghosted over the sea, and behind your reflection, the water continues moving, unseen but implied. The man keeps talking, not in detail, just in outline. Messina, gone. Reggio, gone. Fire, rubble, bodies, and then the sea. He makes a small gesture with his hand, palm rising, then dropping. A wave. He does not call it a tsunami, not yet. He calls it the sea coming in, which is exactly how it would feel. Not a scientific term, just a betrayal with salt on it. You realize something important in that moment. The Strait of Messina is not dangerous because of one thing. It is dangerous because it can switch hazards without warning, like a stage magician changing props. You can prepare for current. You can prepare for wind. You can even prepare for shaking in a theoretical way. But when shaking triggers sliding, and sliding triggers waves, and waves trigger fires, preparation becomes a chain, and chains break. The man sips his coffee. His hand does not shake. That is either courage or practice, or both. He tells you his grandmother used to talk about it like a family ghost story. He tells you the ground moved like an animal trying to throw people off. He tells you the buildings did not simply fall, They poured. That word sticks. Poured. Because it hints at something else. Something more humiliating than collapse. Liquefaction. A technical term that sounds like a kitchen accident. It means the ground, if it is waterlogged and loose, can stop behaving like ground. Shaking turns the soil into a temporary fluid. Foundations lose their grip. Structures tilt, sink, shear. The earth becomes a bad mattress, and your house becomes a heavy thought pressing into it. You picture the neighborhoods along the waterfront, not as they are now with streetlights and parked scooters, but as they were then, in the dark, with people asleep, trusting walls. And you understand why the Strait holds on to that date? Because it proved in one morning that this place can stack disasters faster than humans can interpret them. The ferry gives a small jolt and the man stops talking. He listens to the vibration like a mechanic listens to an engine. Then he relaxes. Nothing. Just the channel doing its constant work. You stand and go back out to the deck, drawn there by the need to see again. Outside, the air feels sharper now, as if your brain has turned up the contrast. The water looks almost peaceful, which is offensive, because you now know what peaceful water can hide. You grip the rail and let your mind begin the slow slide backward in time. Not as a fantasy, not as a movie, as a reconstruction, built from physics and testimony and the simple fact that the earth keeps records. You imagine the winter air of 1908, not the gentle chill of a modern ferry deck, buffered by engines and light. A deeper cold, the kind that stiffens fingers and makes breath visible. Messina is asleep, or trying to be. The city is quieter than it should be, because electricity is young and uneven. Lamps glow dim. The harbor is a dark basin with a few anchored silhouettes. The sea is doing its usual work, reversing on schedule, sliding past itself. No one is watching the seams. No one is reading the water. People are indoors, which is what humans do at night. They assume the planet will continue being a floor. Congratulations. You have reached the part of the story where assumptions become expensive. The first sign is not always sound. Sometimes it is sensation, a subtle vertical lift, like the bed has decided to breathe. Then the shaking arrives, sudden and violent, not a gentle sway. A high-intensity jolt that knocks furniture, wakes animals, snaps the brain into confusion. The ground moves side to side with an impatience that feels personal. Walls crack. Plaster falls like dry snow. People sit up, not understanding yet, because the mind is slow at 3 a.m. Then the real motion hits, the sustained ripping that lasts long enough for panic to organize itself. You run because running is the only verb the body offers. You try for doorways, stairwells, streets. You discover that stairs become traps when they are shaking. You discover that narrow alleys become funnels for rubble. And you discover too late that masonry does not bend. It shatters. Buildings in Messina were heavy then, stone and brick, built for gravity, not for sideways violence. Earthquake forces are sideways insults. A wall that can carry a roof cannot always carry a sudden shove. So facades peel off and fall outward into the streets where people flee. Balconies break loose like teeth. Roofs pancake. The city begins to dismantle itself, one load-bearing failure at a time. And under this, the ground itself begins to misbehave. In places near the coast, soils are young and loose, built from river deposits and reclaimed land. They are full of water. Shaking turns that water into pressure. Pressure lifts grains apart. Friction drops. And the earth, briefly, becomes a slurry. That is liquefaction, translated into human. Your street turns into something that cannot be trusted. Cobblestones buckle. Foundations sink. A building can lean without falling, like it is reconsidering its life choices. Then it slides, because the ground under one side has turned into soup. People fall not because the ground opens, but because it stops being solid. And in the dark, with dust in the air, it feels like the world has been swapped for a worse one. You make it outside, maybe. You reach an open space, a piazza, a wider street. You think open sky equals safety. Sometimes it does. But here, the sea is close, and the sea is listening to the earthquake like a dog hearing its name. Because the earthquake is not just shaking buildings, it is also moving the seafloor. The strait sits on faults that can drop sections of crust. Normal faults, remember, the book sliding off the table. Only now, the table is the planet, and the book is the coastline. When a fault slips, it can change the shape of the seabed in seconds. A sudden drop, a sudden tilt, a sudden shove of water. Water does not like sudden geometry changes. It responds the way a bathtub responds when you kick it. Except this bathtub is a strait, and the kick is the earth itself. People in 1908 do what humans often do after shaking. They run toward the waterfront. It feels open. It feels like nothing can fall on you there. And in many earthquakes, the shoreline is where you can breathe. But this is the Strait of Messina, and it does not offer simple lessons. The harbor, in the dim pre-dawn, looks like a refuge. The sea is flat enough to look obedient, so people gather near it, watching the city behind them collapse and burn. They are not foolish. They are using the information they have. They do not yet know the sea has its own aftershock. Somewhere underwater, a slope fails. It could be triggered by the shaking, by the sudden change in stress, by sediment already poised to slide. The strait has steep underwater flanks, like the land above, only hidden. When those flanks let go, they move fast. A submarine landslide is an avalanche with no air in it. It drags water, displaces it, creates a wave without meeting a distant storm. And even without a landslide, seabed displacement alone can do it. If the seafloor drops on one side, water rushes to fill the space. If it lifts, water is pushed up and outward. The wave begins as a rearrangement, not as a crest. At first, the sea might even pull back, draining from the shore like it is reconsidering. That retreat looks like a miracle to people who are desperate for miracles. They step forward. They follow the water. Because the human mind is wired to investigate, it is an ancient flaw. Then the first wave arrives. Not necessarily the biggest, not necessarily the only one. Just the first heavy correction. It comes in low and fast, more like a moving wall than a curling breaker. It runs into the harbor and turns the waterfront into a battering zone. Boats snap lines. Ships pivot violently, smashing into piers that are already cracked. Water invades streets that are full of rubble, and it uses that rubble as ammunition. Wood, stone, iron, bodies all pushed together in a slurry of impact. If you are standing there, you do not get a cinematic moment. You get confusion, then force, then cold. Salt water in your mouth, in your nose, in your lungs. You try to run, but the ground is broken and the streets are clogged. You try to climb, but the stairs are cracked or blocked. And then the wave recedes, dragging debris back toward the sea, like a hand pulling a tablecloth. People who survive the impact can be pulled off their feet. They get carried into deeper water, into the very currents that already misbehave. Now add darkness. Now add shock. Now add the fact that the current is layered, pulling different parts of your body in different directions. The strait does not drown you gently. It works on you. The second wave arrives, maybe the third. Multiple pulses, because the basin is narrow and reflective, and energy bounces. Because landslides can happen in sequence. Because the sea does not do one clean gesture and stop. It oscillates. It sloshes. The water keeps moving even after the wave has passed. Because the strait is a narrow echo chamber with opinions. The harbor does not just flood, it churns, as if someone has grabbed it and shaken it. Boats slam against stone, and stone is already cracked from shaking, and the cracks widen like yawns. You get the fires next, because earthquakes love to break things that carry flame. Oil lamps tip, stoves spill, gas lines, if they exist, shear. And now the city is rubble that can burn, which is a very efficient kind of fuel. Smoke crawls through streets where dust is still hanging, and breathing becomes a decision. You stand in an open space and realize open space is not the same thing as safe. Safe would require the ground to stop changing its mind. Safe would require the sea to respect the shoreline like a boundary, and it does not. The sea comes in again, smaller or bigger, it hardly matters, because the first wave already taught your body the sensation of helpless sliding. Each retreat pulls loose timbers and broken masonry back toward the water, clearing the way for the next push. It is demolition with a rinse cycle. And while this is happening above, the strait is doing its invisible work below. The layered currents do not pause for disaster. They keep trading places, north against south, surface against depth, like two escalators that never shut down. So when people are dragged off streets into the water, they are not simply pulled outward. They are tugged sideways, then twisted, then pinned in convergence lines where foam and debris collect. The sea organizes the chaos into lanes, and the lanes decide who gets found. You try to imagine rescue in that kind of geometry. You cannot. Not quickly, because rescue needs roads, and roads are now rubble with water in it. Rescue needs ports, and the port is where the sea chose to punch. Rescue needs communication, and communication is a fragile modern habit. Not a guarantee in 1908. Even if someone wants to help, they have to get here. And the strait is still the strait. It is still breathing, reversing, steering ships that think they are steering it. Hours pass in fragments, because trauma does that, and dawn arrives like an insult. Cold gray light reveals what night was able to hide. Entire blocks look scraped. Walls stand without rooms behind them, like stage sets after the play is burned. The waterfront is no longer a line, it is a smear. And the sea, now calmer again, lies there as if it had nothing to do with it, Congratulations, you have survived the shaking and the sea and the fire and the dark. Now you get to survive the aftermath, which is slower and meaner and less cinematic. Thirst arrives early because broken pipes do not care that you are hurt. Injuries become infections because dust and sewage and seawater make a very personal soup. People wander, calling names, stepping over beams that used to be bedrooms, and the strait keeps moving beside them, gentle enough to tempt you close, strong enough to take you if you slip. The numbers will come later, when someone has the strength to count. Tens of thousands, more than the mind can hold as individual faces. You can read that in a book and feel nothing. But if you stand here in this imagined dawn, you understand the scale through absence. A neighborhood is quiet in a way cities are never supposed to be quiet. The quiet is made of missing voices. The quake itself, the one that started it, becomes an argument in science for decades afterward. Which fault moved? How much the seafloor shifted? How much the tsunami came from displacement? And how much came from landslides collapsing into the channel? The strait does not provide clean data. It provides overlapping mechanisms, stacked like bad excuses. But the outline is clear enough to make your stomach tighten. This gap between Sicily and Calabria is not just a passageway. It is a hinge zone in the crust, pulled apart by forces that do not care about cities. Africa nudges into Eurasia, not politely, not quickly, just constantly. The Mediterranean is the grinding surface between them, a slow parking lot collision that never gets resolved. In some places, that collision makes mountains, pushing rock upward into ridges. Here, in this corner, it also stretches the crust, thinning it, breaking it into blocks that drop. Normal faulting, remember? The book sliding off the table. Only the book is a coastline with people on it, and the table is the mantle, hot and patient, delivering motion whether you asked for it or not. The Strait of Messina sits in that tension, like a crack in glass. It is not the only crack in the region, but it is a particularly sharp one. Steep slopes above, steep slopes below, loose sediments on top of older rock, a narrow channel that forces water to accelerate, then reverse, then accelerate again. So when the earth shakes, the sea is already primed to misbehave. And when the sea misbehaves, the slopes are already primed to fail. That is why the disaster stacks so neatly. Not because the planet is malicious, because the ingredients are arranged in a way that makes cascading failure easy. You let the imagined morning of 1908 fade because you cannot stay there too long. Staying there too long is how you start hearing screams that are not present. The ferry brings you back with its steady engines and its routine indifference. You are still on the deck, still in the dark, still watching seams in the water. But now, every seam looks like a memory. The surface glides, then wrinkles, then glides again, like the sea is practicing innocence. The ferry continues crossing, because of course it does. The strait did not close after 1908. Humans do not get to retire geography. We just keep scheduling around it. The coastline ahead grows clearer as the ferry inches closer to Sicily. Messina's port lights brighten, then smear as your eyes adjust. The city looks solid from here, anchored, confident, a string of buildings held together by streetlights. But you know the ground under it has a history of suddenly changing elevation. You know the slopes behind it are cut and terraced like someone has been patching a wound, and you know the sea in front of it can be calm while still moving like a conveyor belt. You feel the temptation to believe that modern engineering has solved this. Better buildings, better warning systems, better maps, better luck. But the strait does not demand perfection from you. It only needs one failure at the wrong hour when the tide is turning. You stay at the rail and watch the mid-channel water for any hint of rotation. You see it again, a small spiral dimple that forms and collapses, then reforms a few meters away. That is the strait breathing through uneven bathymetry, inhaling and exhaling on a schedule written by lunar gravity. The tide here is not a simple rise and fall. It is a swap, a push and pull between basins, each with different density and different timing. The Tyrrhenian Sea to the north is broader, more open to the western Mediterranean. The Ionian Sea to the south is deeper, darker, connected to the eastern basin. They do not fill and empty like matching lungs, so the water uses the strait like a narrow throat, and throats make flow fast. When flow is fast over a rough bottom, it becomes layered. When it becomes layered, it becomes deceptive. If you are looking for danger, you look for waves. But waves are not required. A current line can be as dangerous as a storm if you are small enough. You watch a patch of surface go strangely smooth again. An oiled glass lane. That is not calm water. That is slick water, a boundary where surface turbulence is suppressed, often by sheer below. It is like seeing a quiet patch on a highway and assuming it is safe when it might be black ice. The ferry moves through it without drama, but you can feel the hull's relationship with the water change. A subtle vibration shift, a different hiss. The ship is being touched by a different layer. You picture a smaller boat now, a fishing skiff, low freeboard, a few people, a net, maybe a cheap engine. It is late because people work when they can, not when the sea is convenient. The skiff enters the strait thinking it is just water between coasts. Then the engine has to fight because the surface layer is moving one way and the deeper grip is moving another. The boat yaws like your ferry did earlier, only more. The helmsman corrects. The correction puts the boat into a different current lane. Now the bow is pushed, the stern is pulled, and the boat begins to rotate gently. Not a monster whirlpool, just physics doing what physics does when you give it a narrow channel and uneven depth. You can recover from that rotation if you have room. But room is what the strait does not offer. The coasts are close, and the traffic is constant, and the currents do not care about your fear. That is how accidents happen in places like this. Not in one spectacular moment, but in a chain of small corrections that add up to the wrong position. And if something goes overboard here, the rescue becomes a math problem. With moving numbers, the surface might carry the person north. The deeper return flow might pull them south if they are weighted, exhausted, or tangled. Eddies can trap them in spinning pockets near piers and seawalls. Convergence lines can collect them with debris, which sounds helpful until you realize debris can also pin you under. Even the act of throwing a lifeline becomes complicated. A rope does not travel straight in sideways current. A flotation ring does not drift predictably when surface lanes shift every few meters. The strait takes simple gestures and turns them into negotiations. You feel the ferry slow slightly, or maybe it is just your sense of speed changing as you near the port lights. The captain is setting up for approach again, timing the push, because docking is when precision matters, and precision is harder when the water is trying to slide you sideways. The ferry's angle changes, a small correction, then another. You watch the bow and realize you are not approaching in a straight line at all. You are coming in on a curve designed to arrive where you need to be after the current does its shove. The port structures become clearer: piers, cranes, a forest of poles and cables. And you realize infrastructure here is both lifeline and liability. Cables can snap in quakes, cranes can fall, fuel tanks can rupture, piers can be undermined by tsunami surges or by slower processes like scouring currents eating away at their foundations. The strait does not just threaten boats, it threatens the systems that keep the region functioning. You think about the bridge again, the idea that refuses to die. A fixed link between Sicily and the mainland, a statement of confidence in steel and concrete. People have argued for it for over a century, sometimes as a dream, sometimes as a political talisman. It would be one of the longest spans in the world, high enough for ships, strong enough for wind, flexible enough for quakes. On paper, everything is possible with enough money and enough engineering. But paper does not have to sit over a two-story ocean that reverses direction. Paper does not have to anchor into slopes that want to slide. Paper does not have to endure the kind of ground acceleration that turned buildings into dust in 1908. You can build a bridge, yes, but then you have to live with it and maintain it and evacuate across it and trust it when the sirens start. A bridge would not replace danger. It would concentrate it into a single critical piece of infrastructure that cannot afford to be wrong, which is exactly what the strait likes to punish. The ferry continues its approach, and you pass through another belt of rougher water. This time, you see it in the reflections. Port lights stretch into broken lines on the surface, jittering as the current chops the water into small facets. A passenger near you steadies themselves again, fingers tightening on metal. Small proof repeated. Even here, even near shore, the strait does not fully relax. You look toward the hills behind Messina, darker shapes rising above the port. The slopes feel too steep to hold a city comfortably, and yet the city is there, stacked upward, because humans love coastlines and also hate running out of space. You can sense the logic. Build near the water for trade and fishing. Build higher for safety from floods. Build wherever the road can cut. Then patch the slopes when they move. Then patch the patches. That is what living in an active landscape looks like. Not a single heroic adaptation, but endless maintenance. The ferry's engines change tone again, throttling for docking. The sound becomes a lower, controlled growl, and the deck vibration steadies. You are close enough now to smell the port itself. Salt, yes, but also metal, rubber, old fish, and the faint chemical tang of fuel. Human industry layered over sea air, like perfume over sweat. The ferry slides past a buoy line, and you watch the buoys tilt slightly, tugged by the flow. Even the markers are not still. They strain on their tethers, pointing like weather vanes, revealing the direction of force. You try to read them like an instrument. They tell you the surface is moving one way, but you remember the deeper layer can be moving the other. So the buoy is a half-truth, which is another theme here. Most information is partial. The Strait deals in partial information and expects you to act anyway. You think again about 1908 and the people who ran to the waterfront because it looked open. They acted on the best information they had. The sea punished them for it. Not with malice, with physics. The ferry's hull bumps gently, a contact with the docking structure, and the ship shudders as it settles. Chains clank, ramps prepare to drop. The ordinary mechanics of arrival. You are tempted to feel relief because humans love the idea of getting across something dangerous. But the moment you step onto the Sicilian side, you are not leaving danger behind. You are stepping onto the other lip of the same crack. The land here is part of the same tectonic argument, and the sea behind you is not finished breathing just because you arrived. The ramp lowers with a metallic groan, and warm air from inside the vehicle deck spills out, smelling of tires and sleep. Trucks begin to wake up, engines coughing into life. People stand, stretch, gather bags, act as if this was any other commute. That is how you know the Strait has been normalized, not tamed, just scheduled. You wait a moment before disembarking, watching the water one more time from the docked ferry. It looks flatter now, more domestic, as if the Strait is trying to blend in with the port. But near a piling, you see a tight eddy, water rotating around a fixed object. It is small, harmless looking, almost cute. And yet, you know the same principle scales up mid-channel, where the bottom steps and the flow accelerates. Rotation is not a monster. It is a habit. You step down onto the dock, and the ground feels good under your feet in the way only stable things can feel. Except it is not stable. Not in the deep sense. It is just solid right now. The port is quiet at this hour, but not empty. A few workers in reflective vests move with practiced efficiency. A forklift beeps once, then vanishes behind stacked containers. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, a single territorial note. You walk forward, and the smell of the sea fades behind the smell of asphalt and exhaust. Messina at 3:10 in the morning is a city holding its breath. Apartments rise on the lower slopes. Windows dark, occasional blue television flicker. Streetlights make pools of yellow that do not quite connect, so the spaces between feel deeper. You move inland a little because you want to understand how people live on a fault with a ferry schedule. You take a street that climbs gently away from the port. The pavement is uneven in places, patched, repatched, the scars of utility work and ground settling. You pass a wall with fresh paint over older stains, the city's attempt at neatness, and you notice something that makes your shoulders tighten. The street is narrow, buildings are close, balconies overhang like teeth. In daytime, it would feel charming. At night, with 1908 in your head, it feels like a chute. You imagine shaking here. You imagine masonry shedding into the street. You imagine trying to run uphill in the dark while everyone else has the same idea. Evacuation is not about bravery. It is about geometry. You keep walking, and the slope increases. Stairs appear, cutting between buildings, steep and abrupt. These are the shortcuts people use every day, groceries in hand, complaining about their knees. In an emergency, these stairs become arteries or clots. You put your hand on the railing of one staircase and feel cold metal, damp from sea air. You look down back toward the port and realize how quickly you lose sight of the water. 2 turns, a few buildings, and the strait disappears. That is comforting and also dangerous, because you can forget how close you are to the source of multiple hazards. You can forget until the ground reminds you. You reach a small open space, not quite a piazza, just a widening where streets meet. A parked scooter leans on its stand, innocent. A stray cat watches you from under a car, eyes reflecting streetlight. Everything is ordinary, and yet you cannot stop looking at the walls for signs. Metal ties, reinforced corners, crack repairs. These are the visible footprints of building codes trying to keep up with tectonics. Italy has seismic regulations, and they have evolved often after disaster, because that is when humans become attentive. Newer structures might have reinforced concrete frames designed to flex, not crumble. Retrofitted buildings might have steel braces, or tide floors, or reinforced joints. But not everything is new. Not everything is retrofitted. And soft soils near the waterfront can amplify shaking the way a bowl of jelly exaggerates every tap. You remember the word poured again. Buildings poured in 1908 because the ground lost strength. Liquefaction needs loose sediment and water, and coasts are generous suppliers of both, which means the most convenient parts of the city are also the most amplifying parts. Which is rude, but consistent. The ground by the sea is young, loose, and damp, and young ground is impressionable. When shaking hits, it does not just wiggle, it resonates. It turns the earthquake into a louder version of itself. So you do what humans always do in hazard zones. You start looking for paperwork disguised as street design. You look for signs that point uphill. You look for staircases that do not dead end. You look for open squares that are not surrounded by heavy facades. You are not sightseeing. You are rehearsing. A street sign catches the yellow light and gives you an arrow toward higher ground. It does not say disaster. It says something polite, like evacuation route. The politeness is the point. If it sounded frightening, no one would follow it on an ordinary day. You walk a few blocks and notice how quickly the city becomes vertical. The port is down there, flat and busy, pretending to be stable. Above it, the neighborhoods stack like they are trying to climb out of reach. Elevation is a kind of local insurance policy. Not perfect insurance, but better odds. Because waves need flat ground to run. They lose enthusiasm when the slope gets steep. And the Strait of Messina has no shortage of steep. But steep has its own price. Steep means landslides. Steep means falling rocks. Steep means roads that can be blocked by a single bad collapse. You stop at the mouth of another narrow lane and look up. Balconies hang over it like shelves. Air conditioners cling to walls on metal brackets. Flower pots sit on rails, cheerful and heavy. All of it becomes projectile inventory if the ground moves sideways. You imagine the sound of it. Not one crash, but thousands of small impacts. Tile and glass and plaster raining into the street. The earthquake does not have to topple the whole building to kill you. It just has to shake loose the parts people thought were decorative. You keep walking anyway, because the point of imagining is not to freeze. The point is to see the city the way the planet sees it, as weight stacked on slope, tied down with rebar and hope. A distant truck down by the port lets out a compressed air sigh. The sound floats up between buildings, then fades. It is the kind of ordinary noise that makes you forget geology. The city is very good at making you forget, because forgetting is how people sleep, and people here do sleep most nights on purpose. You pass a newer building with cleaner lines and thicker columns. Its ground floor is more open, less masonry, more concrete frame. You can tell without being an engineer. Old buildings look like they are made of stacked weight. Newer ones look like they are made of skeleton. The skeleton can flex within reason. Within reason is the phrase that keeps repeating in your head, because the earth does not promise anything beyond reason. A small plaque near the entrance mentions retrofitting, steel ties, sheer walls, a date recent enough to suggest funding happened after a scare. This is how seismic safety spreads, not in a smooth wave of upgrades, but in bursts. After the last quake, after the last inspection, after the last politician needed to look responsible, you continue uphill until the streets open slightly. You reach a wider intersection where you can see a strip of the strait again. It is still dark, but the sky is thinning at the edges. The water down there looks like slate, almost calm. You know better than to call it calm. It is simply not advertising its movement right now. A man walks a dog across the intersection. Leash slack, steps slow. The dog sniffs a wall like it has all the time in the world. Neither of them looks toward the sea. They live with it the way you live with weather. Not trusted, not feared, just accounted for. And then you notice something that changes the feeling of the street. A siren pole, not tall, tucked near a public building. It is not an ambulance siren. It is the kind meant to warn, not to chase. It stands there quietly, like a throat that could scream. You walk closer and see a small diagram, a wave icon, an arrow, text explaining what to do if the sea retreats suddenly. Retreat is written as a warning, not a curiosity. That is what 1908 taught them. If the water pulls away, do not follow it. If the water pulls away, run uphill. No debate, no filming, no wondering if you have time. The sign does not mention the layered currents. It does not have to. It only needs to get you away from the first impact zone. After that, the strait can do what it wants with the harbor. You stand there for a moment and let that sink in. Safety here is not a wall you build once. It is a behavior you practice forever. And even then, it is only a chance. You start walking again, this time with a specific goal. You want to feel how far you can get from the water, quickly. Because distance, in a tsunami scenario, is measured in minutes. And stairs, you pick a route that seems obvious, a street that climbs, then a staircase that cuts between two buildings. The steps are worn, polished by years of feet. They shine faintly under the streetlight. You climb them and notice how your breathing changes, not from exertion alone, from the knowledge that this climb is what you would do with adrenaline, with strangers pushing past, with power out, with the ground possibly still shaking in aftershocks. Congratulations, you have found the part of disaster planning that no brochure includes. It is cardio. Halfway up, the staircase turns sharply and narrows, a railing on one side, a wall on the other. If someone falls here, everyone behind them becomes part of the fall. You keep climbing and reach another street. It is steeper, and the buildings are older again. You see crack repairs along plaster, thin lines painted over. You see metal brackets bolted into corners, meant to hold facades in place. You see the city's quiet compromise. We cannot rebuild everything, so we stitch what we can. You continue uphill until the streets begin to quiet. Not empty, but quieter. Fewer trucks, fewer port noises, more sleeping windows. You stop at a small terrace where the view opens. From here you can see the whole geometry. The port below, the curve of the bay, the opposing lights of Calabria across the water. Two coasts staring at each other, close enough to feel personal. And between them, the strait, dark and busy. Even when it looks still, you realize evacuation is not just about where you go. It is about what fails while you are going. An earthquake can cut power. Power loss can kill traffic lights. Traffic without lights becomes a fight, not a flow. A quake can rupture water mains. No water means no firefighting, which is a cruel joke. After shaking, a quake can damage the port. If the port is damaged, supplies slow. If supplies slow, fuel becomes scarce. And fuel is what keeps ambulances moving, and generators running, and rescue boats patrolling. This is the modern hazard chain. Not romantic, not mythic, just logistics collapsing in sequence. And the Strait of Messina sits in the middle of that chain like a hinge. It is the route for help. It is also a barrier for help. If the ferry system is disrupted, Calabria and Sicily become two separate emergencies, each side waiting for the other to send what it cannot. You look down at the water again and imagine a different scenario. Not 1908, not the giant history lesson. Something smaller, more likely, and therefore more dangerous to dismiss. A moderate earthquake at night, strong enough to damage older buildings, strong enough to trigger a few landslides on the steep slopes. Not strong enough to make global headlines, the kind of quake that still ruins lives quietly. The roads along the coast crack, a few retaining walls fail, a hillside gives up a load of rock onto a key intersection. Now the evacuation route you just climbed becomes crowded. Emergency vehicles cannot get uphill quickly. People try to drive anyway because people always try to drive. Cars stall in narrow streets. Now add the strait. If the port is damaged, ferries pause. If ferries pause, supplies pause. And if supplies pause, the city becomes an island, which is what it already is. Only now, it is an island with a damaged throat. You stand on the terrace and let the scale of that settle. Cities do not fail all at once. They fail in parts. And the Strait of Messina is the kind of place that can isolate those parts quickly. A breeze comes up from the water, cooler now. It carries the smell of salt and something faintly fishy. Below, a fishing boat's engine coughs once, then steadies. Fishermen are preparing in the dim pre-dawn, as if the sea has never done anything wrong, which is their job, and their denial, and their courage, all at once. You decide to go back down toward the waterfront, not because it is safer there, because you want to see the city's relationship with the strait up close in daylight. And daylight is coming, whether you approve or not. You descend the stairs carefully, one hand brushing the railing. The metal is cold and slightly sticky with sea air. Your knees feel the steepness on the way down. This is the other truth about evacuation. Going up is hard. Going down is faster. until it is not, until rubble turns steps into a slide, until people turn steps into a jam, until the stairs that save you on one day become the trap on another. You reach the lower streets again and feel the air thicken with port smells, exhaust, rubber, a hint of diesel from idling trucks. The city is waking in small motions. A shutter lifts. A light clicks on in a kitchen window. Somebody drags a chair. It is the sound of a place that keeps going, because stopping is not an option. You walk toward the water line again, and the strait reappears between warehouses. It looks wider now, not because it changed, but because your eyes can see more. The sky is turning from black to bruised purple. The surface of the water shows texture again, faint ripples and darker slick lanes. You stop near a seawall and lean over. Looking down, the water below you is moving. Even here, you can see it in the way foam strands travel sideways along the wall. Not out, not in, but along. A lateral slide that ignores your expectations. You watch a small piece of floating debris, maybe a leaf. It drifts, pauses, then abruptly accelerates as it enters a different lane. That is the strait's personality in miniature. Different rules, a few meters apart. You listen closely because dawn changes the soundtrack. More engines, more gulls, more human noise, layered over the sea's constant hush. But beneath it all, you can still hear the slap of water against stone. Regular, patient, almost like breathing. And this is where you finally understand the myth in a new way. Scylla and Charybdis were not just monsters placed on a map. They were warnings about choice under constraint. The strait narrows you, physically and mentally. It turns the world into a corridor. Corridors make you think in straight lines. But the forces here are not straight. They spiral, they reverse, they shove sideways. So the corridor becomes a lie. And the lie is what kills people who insist on simple routes. A fisherman nearby lays out gear on the pier, hands moving without hurry. You watch him for a moment, and you see how his posture differs from a tourist. He stands like someone who expects the ground to move, not crouched, not fearful, just ready. A kind of relaxed vigilance. The sort of body language you develop when your environment occasionally reminds you who owns the deed. You notice another sign posted on a pole, a map simplified with colored zones. It shows low areas near the waterfront and higher safe zones inland. It shows arrows and gathering points. It is a city trying to turn chaos into a plan, and that is admirable, in the way sandbags are admirable. They do not stop the river forever. They buy you time. Time is what everything here is trying to buy. The problem is that the strait sells time at a terrible exchange rate. Sometimes you get minutes, sometimes you get none. You turn and walk along the waterfront, following the curve of the port. You pass moored boats, ropes creaking softly as water shifts. Each rope is taut in a slightly different direction, because each boat is sitting in a slightly different flow. Even in harbor, even behind breakwaters, the strait's currents find ways to tug. You stop near a cluster of pilings and watch the water between them. There it is again, rotation, a tight eddy spinning like a slow coin. It forms where flow meets obstacle, where momentum has to go somewhere. This is whirlpool physics, stripped of theater. You do not need a funnel to have danger. You just need a spinning patch strong enough to destabilize a smaller craft, or to complicate a rescue swimmer, or to wrap a rope around a piling when you needed it straight. You picture a rescue after an earthquake. People in the water. Debris everywhere. The port damaged, cranes leaning, fuel slicks on the surface. Now imagine sending a small rescue boat into that. The boat has to fight cross currents while dodging floating beams. It has to avoid convergence lines that collect debris into thick mats. It has to avoid getting pinned against structures by lateral flow. And it has to do all of this while aftershocks are still possible. Congratulations, you have invented a scenario where heroism gets punished by fluid dynamics. You keep walking, and you notice the shoreline is engineered. Seawalls, concrete steps, revetments of stone. Humans trying to make the edge stable. But stability is not an object you can install. The sea undercuts, the currents scour, sediment shifts, and earthquakes can drop sections of coast by a small but meaningful amount. A few inches of subsidence is not dramatic in conversation. It is dramatic when your seawall is suddenly lower than the waves it was meant to block. The light strengthens, and the strait becomes visible as a surface again. You can see the bands more clearly now. One lane is darker, smoother. Another is lighter, more rippled. A long line of foam curves across the channel, like someone drew with chalk on moving slate. That foam line is a convergence boundary. Water meeting water, squeezing the floaters into a seam. If you drop something in the water, it will not drift randomly. It will drift with intention, guided by invisible rails. Which means if you ever need to find something, you have to understand the rails. This is why the fishermen watch. This is why the ferry captain corrects early. This is why myths were born here. Because a human being standing on shore can see the sea behaving wrong and still not know why. Your brain wants to call it haunted. Physics is less dramatic but more reliable. The strait is a hydraulic choke point. Two seas with different density and timing exchange water through a narrow gap. That exchange creates strong currents. Those currents reverse with the tide. And because the seabed is uneven, broken by faults and ridges, the currents create standing waves, shear zones, and rotating boils. It is a machine built from shape and gravity. And like any machine, it does not care what you meant to do. You stop again and look across to Calabria. The opposite coast is clearer now. The buildings tiny, the hills behind them steep. It is close enough to feel reachable by swimming, which is a dangerous illusion. Distance over water is measured differently than distance over land. Because over land, you can stop. Over water, stopping is surrender. And surrender, in a layered current, means being carried by whichever layer takes you. You watch a small motorboat further out, cutting across the surface. It leaves a wake, and you can see the wake distort almost immediately. The V-shape breaks. One side gets pulled forward, the other side lags. The wake becomes a skewed signature of the flow. It is the same evidence you saw from the ferry, only now in daylight. The boat compensates, angling slightly, crabbing into the drift. The helmsman knows the rule. Aim beside your destination, not at it. The rule is simple. The execution is not. Because the rule depends on the current staying predictable long enough to matter. And the Strait of Messina does not promise that. Especially near reversal. You check the sky, then the water again, and notice the surface is changing. The foam lines shift, the slick lanes widen, then narrow. The direction of drift near the seawall seems to slow. You are not imagining it. This is the strait approaching a turn in its breathing cycle. The reversal does not happen like a switch. It happens like an argument. First, the surface slows. Then it hesitates. Then it starts moving the other way, but not everywhere at once. Patches flip early, other patches resist. Shear zones sharpen. Rotational boils become more common because the flow is unstable during the handover. This is when small craft get into trouble, not because the current is strongest, though it can be, because it is least consistent. Your brain likes steady forces. Your body can brace against steady. It is the changing forces that knock you over. A gull lands on a bollard and watches the water with you. It is an unimpressed witness. It has probably seen storms and oil slicks and dead fish and the occasional unlucky human. It blinks slowly, as if to say, "This is your problem, not mine." You keep walking until the waterfront thins into a more open stretch. Here, the sea has a little more room, and you can see the texture of the surface extending outward. You notice something else now, a subtle pulsing, not a wave, a periodic strengthening of flow, visible in how ripples compress, then relax. It is the tide doing its slow inhale, then deciding it wants to exhale instead. You are watching a reversal being negotiated in real time, like a crowd trying to decide which door to use. A few seconds of tightening texture, then a loosening, then tightening again. The surface is not changing mood for you. It is responding to gravity from the moon, filtered through a narrow, jagged throat. You lean closer to the seawall and pick a new reference, something stupidly small. A cigarette butt, half soaked, riding the film of the surface like it owns the place. It drifts to the right, pauses, then begins to creep left, not smoothly, in little arguments, as if the water is switching lanes under it. That is your proof that the breathing current is not a single breath. It is lungs with compartments. You watch the foam line a few meters out, and it begins to unspool. The chalk curve breaks into smaller threads, then reknots into a new seam. If you had to throw a life ring right now, you would hesitate. Not because you are cruel, because you would not know which invisible rail would steal it first. Congratulations! You have found the hour where the strait becomes least honest. A fisherman farther down the pier glances up at the same moment you do. He does not look at the sky. He looks at the water's surface like it is a clock face. His shoulders shift and he moves a crate a little farther from the edge. That tiny adjustment is a whole education. This is not superstition. This is pattern recognition, learned the hard way, passed down without needing charts. You keep walking, following the line where the port gives way to open shoreline. The city behind you is still dim, but it is waking in layers. A scooter zips somewhere inland, the sound briefly trapped between buildings. A door clacks. A radio murmurs through an open window, too soft to catch words. The sea keeps doing the louder math. Out here, away from the tightest breakwaters, the surface shows more of its structure. You see long streaks, darker lanes that look like brushed steel. They sit beside brighter rippled patches, like different fabrics stitched together. These are not colors. They are friction differences. Where turbulence is being smothered by shear, the water goes slick. Where flow is tumbling over a seabed step, it roughens, even without wind. You look across again toward Calabria, and the coast seems too near to be real. It is close enough to tempt you into thinking this is a river crossing. But rivers do not reverse twice a day. Rivers do not have a second river underneath, running the other way. The strait does. And right now, those layers are changing shifts. The surface hesitates, then commits. You watch a thin line of bubbles turn and begin to travel the opposite direction. Not everything flips at once. Near-shore water slides one way, mid-channel water slides another, and between them is a seam of confusion. That seam is where rotation is born. You see it form as a faint circular wrinkle, then tighten into a small boil. It is not dramatic enough for a legend. It is dramatic enough for a person in the water, because the moment you are in it, your body becomes a test object. Your legs are in one lane, your shoulders are in another. Your panic tries to pick a direction, and the strait politely disagrees. You watch the fisherman again. He and 2 others begin to push their boat off the stones, careful and practiced. They wait, not for sunlight, but for a moment when the surface tells them the handover is finished. They want consistency more than calm. A small motor coughs. The boat noses out. Immediately it angles, crabbing not pointed where it goes, but where it must aim to arrive. The men are not fighting. They are cooperating with a force that would happily drown them for being stubborn. You keep walking until the shoreline curves, and you can see farther into the channel. Here, the water shows another detail you missed in the dark. A standing line, not exactly a wave, not exactly a seam. It is a low ridge that seems to hover, as if the sea has a bruise. This is where the reverse in flow is meeting the shape of the bottom at a bad angle. Bathymetry is just a word for seabed shape. Translated into human, it means the floor under this water is a broken staircase. When the current tries to reverse over stairs, it does not do it gracefully. It piles up. It creates a pressure bump. It creates turbulence that does not travel. It just persists. You notice birds now, not just gulls, but smaller ones, skimming and hovering. They use the wind that the channel funnels, taking advantage of the same squeeze that troubles ships. The strait is generous that way. It will endanger you and assist a bird in the same breath. A man walks past you carrying a net bundle, eyes half open, boots wet. He nods without curiosity, the way locals acknowledge a fellow insomniac. You nod back, and he keeps going, because nobody here has time to explain the sea to you. The sea already did. You stop where the rocks are piled into a rough break, and you look down between them. Water surges in and out of gaps, not with waves, but with current pressure. It makes a sound like slow swallowing. Each surge leaves a lace of bubbles, then pulls them away. If a quake happened right now, you would not need to imagine the sea's response. You are already watching it practice. The thought arrives without being invited. How fast would you know? Not that an earthquake happened, you would know that immediately. How fast would you know if it was the kind that would send the sea walking in again? There are warning systems now. There are sensors and sirens and automated messages. But the first warning is still the same one people had in 1908. The water behaving wrong. Only now, you know that wrong can look like a retreat. That wrong can look like a pause between breaths. A small van drives along the port road, headlights pale in the growing light. It passes a posted evacuation map and does not slow. Life does not slow for Hazard. Hazard waits for life to relax. You turn inland again, not climbing far this time, just enough to see the geometry. From a slightly higher street, you can see the seam of the strait and both coasts at once. The sky is now gray lavender, dawn finally committing. The water becomes a sheet of moving slate, and the seams stand out like veins. You listen instead of staring. Distant engines, a ferry horn far away, low and brief. The clink of rigging, the slap of water against concrete, and underneath it, the steadier hush of flow. That hush is the strait's most reliable sound, because it is not a sound of surface weather. It is a sound of mass moving through constraint. Your brain, always hungry for a pattern, begins to file what you have seen into a rule. Strongest trouble at reversal. Rotation born at seams. Standing bumps at underwater steps. But then the strait offers you the next complication. A quiet reminder that there is no single rule. The nearshore water below you begins to run faster, and you feel it through the visuals. Foam accelerates along the wall, and a mooring rope tightens on a boat below, singing a thin note. The current has chosen a new direction. Yes, it has also chosen a new speed. Reversals do not just flip direction, they can bring surge. The exchange between basins has to catch up, like traffic after a light turns green. For a few minutes, the flow can be especially eager. That eagerness is what makes the strait feel alive, even when nothing is happening. And now imagine you are not watching for curiosity. Imagine you are watching because someone is in the water. You picture a simple accident. A worker slips from a dock. A fisherman gets tangled. A tourist does the unthinkable and jumps because the other coast looks close. In many places, you throw a flotation device and you point. Here, you throw and you calculate. You lead the target like a hunter aiming ahead of a moving animal. Only the animal is the water itself, and it changes speed without warning. You feel the cruelty of that. Not emotional cruelty, mechanical cruelty, a place where rescue depends on reading invisible layers. You walk back toward the more central waterfront, closer to the port mouth. As you approach, the engineered edges return. Concrete walls, metal ladders, rust stains where sea spray has worked for years. The city has reinforced its boundary, and the boundary has still been chewed. You see patched sections where concrete has been replaced. You see new bolts on older metal. Maintenance as a lifestyle. A seagull pecks at something near a drain outlet, then hops away. Stormwater drains here are like small promises. We can handle water coming from the land. No one installs a drain for water coming from the sea. That is the unspoken terror. Land sends manageable water. The strait sends verdicts. The port is more awake now. A crane lights blink. A forklift moves a pallet. Workers gather in little knots, smoking, hands in pockets. The smell of coffee appears, thin and sharp. The human world tries to build its morning routine right on the edge of a fault and a tide machine. It is either brave or unavoidable. Probably both. You stop near the spot where you first leaned over the seawall, and you watch the same lanes again. The slick patches have shifted. The foam seams have redrawn. The direction is now more consistent, flowing steadily for the moment. That steadiness is a relief, and you distrust it immediately because you know what steady flow can do over time. Scour, undercut, eat away at foundations. A current does not have to be dramatic to be destructive. It only has to be persistent. You think about the underwater world beneath this port. Pipes, cables, anchor chains, moorings, all the hidden infrastructure that makes the surface city feel modern. Now imagine a strong quake and a turbidity current, an underwater sediment avalanche triggered by shaking or a slope failure. It rushes down the strait floor like a dark river, hugging the bottom. It can snap submarine cables the way a falling tree snaps a clothesline. It can shift sediments around pilings. It can undermine something that looked solid yesterday. You would not see it happen. You would see the consequences later, when communication fails, when a structure tilts, when water looks strangely discolored. The strait's violence is often offstage. You find yourself looking for the siren pole again, that quiet throat that could scream. You spot another one farther along, mounted near a public building, painted clean. It is comforting in a bleak way. Acknowledge the hazard, and it becomes slightly less mythic. But sirens are only as useful as the time they buy. And time here can be stingy. A quake close enough gives you seconds, maybe a few minutes. Enough for a sprint, not enough for debate. Enough for stares, not enough for collecting things you will miss. Enough for survival if you are already ready. And most people, most mornings, are not. They are thinking about work. They are thinking about school. They are thinking about coffee. You cannot blame them. If you lived every day as if 1908 was about to repeat, you would never sleep. So instead, the city does what cities do. It externalizes fear into infrastructure, signs, sirens, retrofits, drills. And then it goes back to normal because it has to. Your own body starts to settle into that rhythm too. The light is stronger now. The cold has softened. The strait looks almost polite. And that is when your mind tries to commit its most dangerous trick. It tries to file all this under rare events. Earthquakes are rare. Tsunamis are rare. Disaster is rare. But the ingredients are not rare. The fault is still there. The slope is still steep. The sediments are still loose in the wrong places. The current still reverses. Twice a day. Forever. The ferry schedule still depends on timing. The port still concentrates people and fuel and machinery at the edge. The risk is not rare. The outcomes are. That difference matters because it is the difference between a story and a system. You decide to do one more small test just to satisfy the part of your brain that needs evidence. You find a spot where the water is clear enough to see surface drift cleanly. You pick up a small pebble from the edge, not large enough to hurt anything, just enough to make a mark. You toss it gently into the water and watch the splash ring. The rings expand, and immediately they are skewed. The right side stretches faster. The left side compresses. The strait edits even your circles. Then the pebble sinks, and for a second, you can see a tiny trail of bubbles. The bubbles do not go straight up. They slant, That slant is the deeper layer reaching up, tugging even the rising air. It is a small, humiliating demonstration. You cannot even drop a pebble without the strait turning it into a lesson. A worker nearby glances at you, expression neutral. You look away, suddenly aware you are performing science like a bored child. You step back from the edge and keep moving. As you walk, you pass a cluster of older buildings near the waterfront, their facades patched and repainted. Some have metal ties, little star-shaped plates bolted into masonry. These are not decorations. They are structural stitches meant to keep walls from peeling away. You can see the city's memory and hardware. Not everyone installs these in times of peace. They install them because someone remembers what falling masonry sounds like. You turn a corner and find a small plaque on a wall, worn, with text you do not fully read. You do not have to. The dates are enough. 1908 appears again, like a bruise the city cannot cover. It is everywhere if you look for it. In building choices, in evacuation signage, in the way older residents speak of the big one without drama, in the way the port has rules that feel excessive until you understand the physics. You walk toward a slightly higher vantage again, not to flee, but to watch the strait in full light. From here, the channel looks almost like a river mouth. You can see long streaks of different colored water, subtle but real. This is mixing, and incomplete mixing. Two seas exchanging water without fully blending because the flow is too fast and too layered. Density differences matter here. Saltier, colder water tends to sit lower. Warmer, slightly fresher water tends to ride higher. So even when the current reverses, the layers can keep their identity. That identity is what creates the two-story effect and the tug of war on anything with depth. A ship has a hull that reaches into both floors, so it gets conflicting boats. You think of the ferry again, the angled approach, the captain steering for where the port will be. That is not just experience. It is a response to layered water, to cross currents that are not a single arrow on a map. You also think of the bridge idea again, because it always comes back in this strait. It is hard not to imagine a clean span, a fixed line, a refusal to be delayed by tide. Humans love fixed lines. We draw borders and lanes and schedules, and we pretend the planet agreed. A bridge would be an argument made of steel. But the strait is already an argument made of water and rock, and it has been arguing longer. If you build the bridge, you do not remove the strait's hazards. You add a new element that must survive all of them at once. Wind funneled through the gap, seismic shaking from nearby faults, possible surface rupture or seafloor displacement, currents scouring foundations, and the human factor, always underrated. Maintenance budgets, political cycles, inspections done well or done lazily. A bridge is not a structure. It is a lifelong obligation. In a place where the ground itself refuses to hold still, obligation becomes a gamble. The sun is still not up, but the horizon is bright enough now to flatten shadows. You can see more detail in the hills across the water. Steep gullies, pale scars, road cuts that look like slices through unstable cake. The land on both sides is young in geological terms, not young like a child, young like an injury that has not finished healing. The Mediterranean region is still being rearranged, still compressed and stretched by the slow push of Africa into Eurasia. That push is not a headline. It is a constant pressure, like a hand on your shoulder that never lifts. In some places, the pressure makes mountains. In others, it pulls the crust apart locally, creating basins and faults. Here, the crust has been thinned and fractured, and the strait is one of the visible consequences. The same forces that make Etna possible, the same forces that fold southern Italy, also load the faults beneath this water. You are not just standing near a dangerous channel, you are standing near a boundary zone in a restless sea. The city continues to wake behind you. A bus groans up a street, empty or nearly empty, headlights pale. A bakery vent releases warm air that smells faintly of yeast. The smell is comforting enough to make you hate it, because comfort is what makes people forget to run drills. Comfort is what makes you leave the go bag in the closet. Comfort is what makes you stand at the waterfront filming a retreating sea. And the strait, patient as ever, counts on comfort. You move again, drifting without urgency, because your role here is not to escape, it is to witness the system as it operates on an ordinary morning. Ordinary is the key word. The disasters are dramatic. The hazard is ordinary. That is what makes this place different from a volcano summit or a hurricane landfall. Those announce themselves. This does not. It sits between two coasts and keeps working. You stop near a small group of fishermen now gathered at the edge. They talk quietly, gesturing with chins toward the water. Their conversation is mostly practical. Drift direction, where the fish might gather along a seam, where debris collects. They use the strait's danger as a tool. Convergence lines that would trap a struggling swimmer also concentrate floating food, which attracts fish. Eddies that complicate rescues also hold bait longer. The same physics that threatens you also feeds you if you learn its language. That is the uncomfortable beauty of it. Hazard and livelihood braided together. You watch them cast. The lines arc out, land on the surface, and immediately curve. The current grabs the line and belly bows it sideways. One fisherman adjusts his stance and angle, not annoyed, just accepting. He is not casting into water. He is casting into moving geometry. A gull dives, comes up with nothing, looks offended. Somewhere across the channel, a ferry moves. Smaller in the distance, its wake writing a brief signature that gets erased. You realize how many crossings happen here every day. How many trucks, how many commuters, how many tiny decisions made correctly, simply because routine teaches you. Routine is what keeps the casualty count low on normal days. Not because the hazard is low, because the system has adapted. But adaptation has limits. It can handle tides. It can handle moderate storms. It can handle small quakes. It struggles with the compound day, when multiple hazards stack at once. Quake at night, power loss, port disruption, fire, road blockage,